The Dominion Intelligence Bureau operated with the mechanical precision of a galaxy-spanning bureaucracy, which is to say, it functioned about as efficiently as a three-legged giraffe attempting ballet. Their headquarters on Prime Station housed the most comprehensive database of species classifications in known space, a testament to their dedication to cataloging every sentient race's potential for contributing something meaningful to galactic civilization. The keyword being potential, which in humanity's case appeared to be roughly equivalent to that of a particularly ambitious houseplant. Agent Dex 9 adjusted his optical sensors as he reviewed the latest batch of evaluations, his crystalline form refracting the soft blue light of his workstation. The humans had finally been processed through their comprehensive assessment protocol, and the results were, to put it diplomatically, spectacularly underwhelming. To put it less diplomatically, they were the kind of scores that made one question whether the evaluation committee had accidentally tested a colony of particularly clever bacteria instead. Technological advancement 2.3 out of 100, he read aloud to his colleague Agent Flux Prime, whose gaseous form rippled with what might have been amusement. They've barely managed to escape their own gravity well without killing themselves in the process. Their idea of advanced propulsion involves controlled explosions, controlled being a generous term. Flux Prime's ethereal voice carried the galactic equivalent of a snort. At least they've achieved spaceflight. What's their warfare rating? 1. Dex 9's optical array dimmed in what his species used to indicate profound disappointment. Their military doctrine appears to center around pointing increasingly elaborate projectile weapons at each other while shouting about abstract concepts like freedom and honor. They've somehow managed to create weapons capable of sterilizing their entire planet, yet remain baffled by the concept of not using them. The evaluation continued with the grim determination of a funeral procession. Diplomatic sophistication clocked in at a devastating 1.2, primarily because humanity's idea of interspecies negotiation involved either offering sugary beverages or threatening to introduce alien visitors to something called nuclear deterrent. Their cultural development scored slightly higher at 3.1, though the evaluators noted with concern that humans appeared to derive entertainment from watching other humans engage in elaborate forms of voluntary suffering, which they had inexplicably categorized as sports. Evolutionary stability proved equally disheartening at 1. The assessment team had been particularly perplexed by humanity's apparent evolutionary strategy of developing increasingly complex brains, while simultaneously using said brains to devise methods of avoiding natural selection entirely. They had effectively broken their own evolutionary process through what the report diplomatically termed aggressive medical intervention and stubborn refusal to accept mortality. Biophysical optimization, Flux Prime inquired, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. 0.8 out of 100. Dex 9 replied with the weary resignation of someone who had seen too many disappointing evaluation reports. They require constant atmospheric support, can survive on approximately 30% of known planetary environments without extensive technological assistance, and their physical forms appear to have been designed by committee. A particularly dysfunctional committee that couldn't agree on basic specifications. The report elaborated with clinical precision on humanity's biological shortcoming. Their sensory apparatus was laughably limited, perceiving only a narrow spectrum of electromagnetic radiation and sound frequencies. Their physical durability ranked somewhere between overripe fruit and wet tissue paper. Most bewildering of all, they required unconsciousness for approximately 8 hours out of every 24-hour cycle, during which they became completely vulnerable and occasionally experienced hallucinations they insisted on sharing with others as dreams. Psychosocial compatibility earned humanity their highest score at a whopping 4.2, though this was primarily attributed to their inexplicable tendency to form emotional attachments to other species, including ones that showed clear signs of wanting to eat them. The evaluation team had been simultaneously fascinated and horrified by humanity's capacity for what they termed weaponized empathy, the ability to anthropomorphize literally anything with sufficient enthusiasm. Dex 9 compiled the final assessment with the mechanical thoroughness that had made him the Bureau's go-to evaluator for disappointing civilization, placing them firmly in the developmental dead-end category alongside the crystalline singers of Vega 7, who had achieved enlightenment and then immediately lost interest in anything requiring effort, and the hive mind of Andromeda Prime, whose collective intelligence had become so advanced, It had transcended into pure thought and forgotten to maintain its physical infrastructure. Classification recommendation, Flux Prime asked, already preparing the filing protocol. Category 7, benign negligible influence. Dex 9 announced with the satisfaction of a job thoroughly, if disappointingly, completed. Note for strategic planning. Species poses no conceivable threat to galactic stability. Technological development curve suggests they will either achieve basic interstellar capability in approximately 500 standard years, or accidentally eliminate themselves trying. Current assessment indicates the latter probability. The report was filed with the efficient indifference of a bureaucracy that had processed thousands of similar evaluations. Earth's coordinates were updated in the strategic databases with the cosmic equivalent of a yawn, marked with the designation that effectively meant nothing interesting here. Move along. Their solar system received the galactic equivalent of a participatory trophy, acknowledged to exist but not expected to contribute anything meaningful to the greater conversation of civilized space. In the vast network of the Dominion's intelligence apparatus, humanity had been officially categorized as that species every galactic community seemed to have, the well-meaning but utterly harmless neighbors, who occasionally made noise but posed about as much strategic significance as a particularly vocal pet. They were filed under quaint local curiosities alongside 17 other species, who had somehow achieved rudimentary spaceflight despite their obvious evolutionary The Dominion's military strategists updated their threat assessment matrices, and Earth's entry was automatically assigned to the ignore unless directly contacted category. After all, why waste valuable resources monitoring a species whose greatest achievement appeared to be not accidentally destroying themselves before lunch? The galaxy had real threats to worry about, actual civilizations capable of meaningful military, technological, or economic impact. As far as the Dominion was concerned, humanity was safely categorized as the galactic equivalent of that awkward cousin everyone tolerated at family gatherings, but nobody expected to accomplish anything noteworthy. They had been measured, evaluated, classified, and filed away with the comfortable assurance that they would remain exactly where they belonged, on the periphery of galactic civilization, blissfully unaware of their own cosmic irrelevance. The bureaucratic machine moved on to more pressing matters, leaving behind a filing system that would, in retrospect, be remembered as one of the most spectacular intelligence failures in recorded galactic history. The Xerathi Empire approached galactic conquest with the methodical enthusiasm of a particularly efficient exterminator, which was essentially what they were. Their war machine had been perfecting the art of systematic subjugation for over 3 millennia, turning the process into something resembling performance art. They didn't simply conquer civilizations, they conducted symphonies of destruction, with the precision of master musicians, each campaign a carefully orchestrated movement in their grand composition of galactic domination. High Admiral Vextal surveyed the tactical displays from the command throne of the inevitable conclusion, flagship of the Xerathi 4th Conquest fleet. The holographic projections showed their latest campaign's progress with the satisfying regularity of a well-maintained chronometer. 17 star systems had fallen in the past standard month, their advanced civilizations reduced to administrative footnotes in approximately the time it took most species to decide what to have for breakfast. The Altarians, those technologically sophisticated crystalline beings, who had foolishly believed their energy shields could withstand Xerathi firepower, had lasted exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. Their surrender came when they realized their supposedly impenetrable planetary defenses were being systematically dismantled by weapons that operated on principles their greatest scientists couldn't even comprehend, much less counter. The Vegan Collective, a hive mind civilization that had boasted of their instantaneous communication and coordinated response capabilities, managed a slightly more respectable 6 hours and 12 minutes. Their downfall came when the Xerathi demonstrated that superior firepower had a way of disrupting even the most sophisticated neural networks, particularly when applied directly to the central processing nodes with surgical precision. Status report on the Centauri campaign, Vextal commanded, his forearms manipulating the tactical interface with the fluid grace of a conductor directing his orchestra. Complete capitulation achieved in 7 hours, 14 minutes, responded Fleet Commander Hex 9, her voice carrying the professional satisfaction of someone who took pride in efficient work. The Centaurians attempted to negotiate approximately 47 times during the engagement. Their diplomatic protocols appear to have been designed by someone with a touching faith in the power of reasonable discourse, Vextal's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among his species. The Centaurians had been particularly entertaining in their desperate attempts to find common ground, offering everything from cultural exchanges to economic partnerships while their orbital defenses were being systematically reduced to constituent atoms. They seemed genuinely baffled by the concept that some conflicts couldn't be resolved through carefully worded treaties and mutual understanding. The Conquest fleet's progress reports read like a catalogue of galactic civilization's greatest hits, each entry a testament to the Xerathi Empire's overwhelming superiority. The Andromedan Trade Federation, despite their vaunted commercial networks and economic influence, had folded when the Xerathi demonstrated that market forces were surprisingly ineffective against antimatter torpedoes. The Polaris Scientific Collective, those insufferably smug researchers who believed knowledge was the ultimate power, discovered that their vast databases were remarkably combustible when exposed to Xerathi plasma bombardment. What made each victory particularly satisfying was the predictability of it all. Every species followed essentially the same pattern: initial disbelief, desperate resistance, futile negotiations, and finally capitulation when they realized that their cherished technological advantages meant precisely nothing against Xerathi military doctrine. It was almost boring in its consistency, like solving the same mathematical equation repeatedly with different variables that always yielded identical results. Admiral Fleet Commander Hex 9 announced, her tone suggesting she had encountered something requiring attention. We've received refugee communications from the conquered systems. Approximately 47 vessels carrying various species are fleeing toward the Outer Rim territories. Standard procedure, Vextal replied without looking up from his strategic assessments. Let them. Fear spreads more efficiently than our fleets can travel. By the time we reach their destinations, half the work of demoralization will already be complete. The refugee ships scattered across space like seeds on cosmic wind, carrying with them tales of Xerathi invincibility that would reach unconquered systems weeks before the actual invasion fleets arrived. This psychological warfare was nearly as effective as their actual weapons, creating an atmosphere of hopeless dread that made subsequent conquests even more straightforward. Civilizations surrendered before the first shots were fired, having already accepted their inevitable defeat through second-hand terror. Among the fleeing vessels was a motley collection of survivors representing the galaxy's former military and scientific elite. They carried with them the accumulated knowledge of dozens of fallen civilizations, their databanks filled with tactical analyses, weapons specifications, and strategic assessments that all reached the same grim conclusion: the Xerathi Empire was simply unstoppable. Their technology was superior, their tactics flawless, and their resolve absolute. Admiral Hex 9 continued, consulting her tactical displays with professional interest. Long-range sensors have detected an uncharted system in grid section. 3 refugee vessels appear to be heading in that direction. Vextal finally looked up from his strategic projections, his 4 eyes focusing on the relevant sector of space. Grid Section 7 Alpha was indeed largely uncharted, one of those backwater regions that civilized space tended to ignore on the reasonable assumption that anything worth finding would have been discovered already. The fact that refugees were fleeing there suggested either desperate hope or complete navigational incompetence. System designation, he inquired, though his tone suggested minimal interest. Local designation appears to be Sol, Hex 9 reported after consulting the navigation databases. Preliminary scans indicate a single inhabited planet in the system's 3rd orbital position. Species classification, she paused, accessing the Dominion Intelligence Bureau's files. Category 7, benign negligible influence. The bridge fell silent for a moment as the crew processed this information. A 2.1 rating was impressively low, even by the standards of species that had managed to achieve spaceflight through sheer cosmic accident. Most civilizations that scored below 5.0 were classified as interesting but irrelevant, while anything below 3.0 typically meant harmless to the point of being decorative. Military capability assessment, Vextal asked, though he was already calculating how long it would take to add this system to their growing collection of conquered territories. Primitive kinetic weapons, basic orbital infrastructure, negligible space fleet, Hex 9 read from the intelligence files. Threat level assessed as essentially non-existent. The species appears to be called humans, and according to these files, their primary military strategy involves pointing projectile weapons at each other while making loud noises. Vextal's mandibles clicked with genuine amusement. A species whose military doctrine centered around pointing projectile weapons while making loud noises.
hardly seemed worth the fuel expenditure required to reach their system. Still, completeness was important in any professional conquest campaign, and leaving unconquered territories behind could set unfortunate precedents. Fleet deployment recommendation, he asked, already knowing the answer. Single destroyer should be sufficient, Hex 9 replied with the confidence of someone who had overseen the conquest of significantly more impressive civilizations. Standard pacification protocols, minimal resource allocation, estimated conquest time, 37 minutes, accounting for travel time between orbital facilities. The Admiral nodded approvingly. 37 minutes seemed generous for a species rated at 2.1, but thoroughness was a virtue in military planning. Besides, they had time to spare while the main fleet consolidated their recent conquests and prepared for the next phase of expansion into the galactic core systems. Dispatch the inevitable resolution, Vextal commanded. Captain Zek 4 has been complaining about lack of action. This should provide adequate exercise for his crew without risking valuable assets. As the orders were transmitted across the fleet's command network, the Xerathi military machine added another destination to its inexorable march across the galaxy. The Sol system was marked for conquest, with the same bureaucratic inefficiency that had processed hundreds of similar objectives, filed under minor cleanup operations, alongside systems containing crystalline gardens, gaseous philosophers, and other cosmic curiosities that posed no meaningful resistance. The refugees fleeing toward Earth carried with them the accumulated despair of a galaxy under siege, their ships loaded with the technological marvels and military expertise of dozens of fallen civilizations. They were heading toward what they hoped might be a temporary sanctuary, a backwater system so insignificant that even the Xerathi Empire might overlook it long enough for them to catch their breath and plan their next desperate escape. None of them bothered to study the intelligence files on the local inhabitants too closely. After all, a species rated 2.1 out of 100 was hardly likely to offer anything useful in terms of military assistance or strategic insight. They were fleeing toward Earth, not because they expected help, but because it was the kind of place cosmic conquerors typically ignored until they had nothing better to do. The irony of this decision would become apparent soon enough, though at the time it seemed like the most reasonable choice available to beings whose entire understanding of military conflict had just been rendered obsolete by Xerathi's superiority. They were about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones that seem perfectly logical right up until reality demonstrates otherwise.
The inevitable resolution dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, with all the fanfare of a predator arriving at a petting zoo. Captain Zek 4 reviewed his mission parameters with the weary professionalism of someone who had been assigned what amounted to cosmic janitorial work. 37 minutes seemed almost insultingly generous for a species whose technological achievements apparently peaked somewhere around controlled combustion. But military protocol demanded proper procedure regardless of target insignificance. His first surprise came when the humans actually noticed his arrival. Most primitive species required several hours to detect incoming vessels, assuming they possessed detection equipment more sophisticated than looking up really hard. The humans not only spotted his destroyer within minutes, but immediately began broadcasting what appeared to be communications attempts on approximately 47 different frequencies simultaneously, as if they couldn't decide which method might work and had opted to try everything at once. "Translation protocols active," announced his communications officer. "They appear to be asking questions, Captain." "Questions?" Zek 4's mandibles twitched with curiosity. Most species either surrendered immediately or issued dramatic proclamations about defending their homeworld. Questions suggested a level of intellectual curiosity that seemed inconsistent with a 2.1 intelligence rating. "They want to know our intentions, our point of origin, whether we require assistance, our technological specifications, our biological requirements, our political structure, our economic systems, and," the officer paused, "whether we would be interested in something called pizza." The bridge fell silent. In 3 millennia of galactic conquest, no species had ever responded to the arrival of a Xerathi warship by offering food. The tactical computers, programmed to analyze thousands of possible enemy responses, had no protocols for dealing with unsolicited culinary hospitality. "Standard invasion ultimatum," Zek 4 commanded, deciding to proceed with established procedure. "Demand immediate surrender. Threaten orbital bombardment. Allow 30 standard minutes for compliance." The human response arrived in 17 minutes, which was either impressively efficient or suggested they hadn't bothered to actually consider the ultimatum serious. What they transmitted back was even more baffling than their initial questions. They declined to surrender, his communications officer reported with the tone of someone reading something he didn't quite believe. However, they would like to negotiate terms, propose alternative arrangements, offer cultural exchange programs, invite us for diplomatic dinner, and, another pause, ask if we play something called poker. Xek-4 consulted his tactical manual. Chapter 47, Responses to Invasion Ultimatums listed 18 possible categories of enemy reaction, ranging from immediate capitulation to desperate last stand. None of them included invitation to gambling and social dinner. Begin orbital bombardment of military installations, he ordered, falling back on standard procedure. Perhaps they'll become more reasonable once they see our firepower. This was where the situation began to deviate significantly from the established script. The humans did indeed have military installations, though installation seemed like an overly generous term for what appeared to be collections of buildings with weapons pointed in various directions. What puzzled Xek-4 was that destroying these facilities didn't seem to discourage the humans so much as annoy them. Instead of surrendering, they began shooting back. This itself wasn't unusual. Many species attempted futile resistance before accepting the inevitable. What was unusual was that the humans seemed to be improvising their defensive strategy in real time, as if they were making up military doctrine on the spot. Their weapon systems were indeed primitive by galactic standards, but they were using them in ways that suggested either tactical genius or complete ignorance of proper military procedure. "Captain," his tactical officer reported with growing confusion, "they're launching what appears to be garbage." Garbage? Various forms of debris, obsolete satellites, decommissioned spacecraft, and what sensors identify as approximately 40,000 tons of metallic refuse. They've somehow managed to create a debris field that's interfering with our targeting system. Xek-4 stared at the tactical display. The humans had effectively weaponized their own space junk, turning centuries of orbital pollution into an impromptu defensive shield. It was simultaneously brilliant and ridiculous, like watching someone defeat a master swordsman by throwing handfuls of pocket lint. But the real surprise came when the human military forces began adapting to Xerathi tactics faster than any species in recorded history. They couldn't match Xerathi firepower, so they stopped trying. Instead, they began using guerrilla tactics that seemed to be based on the revolutionary concept of if you can't fight fair, don't fight fair. Human vessels began appearing from impossible directions, using gravitational slingshots and orbital mechanics in ways that violated several established principles of civilized warfare. They hid behind asteroids, inside gas giant atmospheres, and even camouflaged themselves as space debris. Their attacks were uncoordinated, unpredictable, and utterly maddening in their effectiveness. "They're not following standard engagement protocols," his tactical officer complained after the 7th human ambush in as many hours. "Their attack patterns don't match any known military doctrine." Because they don't have military doctrine, Xek-4 realized with growing unease. They're improvising. This was the moment Captain Xek-4 began to understand that he might have seriously underestimated the situation. A species with no established military traditions was also a species with no preconceived notions about how space combat was supposed to work. They weren't bound by millennia of tactical evolution and strategic orthodoxy. They were making it up as they went along, and their improvisational approach was proving surprisingly effective against enemies who expected civilized, predictable resistance. The 37-minute estimate had now stretched to 6 hours, then 12, then 24. The inevitable resolution found itself engaged in running battles with human forces that appeared and disappeared like cosmic ghosts striking from unexpected angles, with weapons that shouldn't have been effective but somehow kept inflicting damage through sheer persistence and creative application. Worse, the humans were learning. Each engagement taught them something new about Xerathi capabilities, and they adapted their tactics accordingly with disturbing speed. They began targeting specific systems, exploiting weaknesses that shouldn't have been apparent to such a primitive species, coordinating attacks with increasing sophistication. "Captain," his communications officer announced with barely concealed panic, "we're receiving communications from refugee vessels in the outer system. They're reporting that human forces are offering assistance." Zek 4's mandibles clicked nervous. The refugees were survivors from dozens of advanced civilizations, carrying with them the military knowledge and technological expertise of the galaxy's former elite. If they were sharing that information with the human, "Sir," his tactical officer added with the tone of someone delivering very bad news, "long-range sensors are detecting additional human vessels approaching from multiple vectors. They appear to be armed with weapons that don't match our technical specifications for this system." Captain Zek 4 stared at the tactical display as the grim realization dawned. The humans weren't just fighting back, they were learning, adapting, and apparently receiving technological upgrades from some of the most advanced military minds in the galaxy. His quick cleanup mission was rapidly turning into something that looked suspiciously like a real battle. For the first time in his military career, Zek 4 found himself considering the possibility that a 2.1 rated species might actually present a genuine threat. The thought was so absurd it was almost physically painful, but the evidence was mounting with each passing hour. These humans were proving that sometimes the most dangerous enemy was the one who didn't know they were supposed to lose. Admiral Vextil received Captain Zek 4's retreat request with the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for cosmic phenomena that violated fundamental laws of physics. The message had arrived 48 hours after the inevitable resolution was supposed to have finished its cleanup operation and moved on to more pressing matters. Instead, Zek 4 was requesting immediate reinforcements and tactical support for what he described, with obvious reluctance, as unexpected complications. "Define unexpected complications," Vextil transmitted back, though he suspected he was about to hear something that would require significant revision of his understanding of galactic warfare. The response came with video documentation that made every officer on the flagship's bridge question their grasp of basic military principles. The humans had not only refused to surrender, but had somehow managed to turn their entire solar system into a three-dimensional maze of improvised defenses, guerrilla ambush points, and what appeared to be weaponized construction equipment. "They've been modifying asteroids," Zek 4 reported with the tone of someone describing a particularly unpleasant fever dream. "They're using mining explosives as torpedoes, construction vessels as assault craft, and they've somehow convinced the refugee populations to share advanced technology in exchange for," he paused, consulting his notes, "pizza, coffee, and something called movie nights." The tactical displays showed a solar system that had been transformed into a fortress through sheer human stubborn creativity. They had weaponized their space infrastructure, militarized their civilian vessels, and apparently convinced some of the galaxy's most advanced refugees to help them by offering snacks and entertainment. It was so utterly illogical that it had somehow. But the real shock came when Fleet Commander Hex 9 attempted to access the Dominion Intelligence Bureau's files for strategic guidance and discovered that Earth's classification had been locked pending emergency review. The bureaucrats who had so confidently filed humans under benign negligible influence were now scrambling to understand how their 2.1 rated species had managed to halt a Xerathi invasion force. "Status update from the assessment committee," Hex 9 announced, her voice carrying the professional strain of someone trying to maintain composure while reporting the impossible. "They're requesting permission to revise the human classification to under investigation pending new data analysis." The new data was arriving in real time as human forces continued their impossible resistance. They had somehow jury-rigged refugee technology into their own systems, creating hybrid weapons that shouldn't have worked but were proving devastatingly effective. More troubling, they were coordinating their efforts with increasing sophistication, learning advanced tactics from their alien allies, while contributing their own brand of chaotic innovation. "The humans appear to have a natural aptitude for what they call thinking outside the box," reported the tactical analysis team after reviewing hours of engagement data. "Their military doctrine, if it can be called that, seems to be based on the principle that established rules are merely suggestions to be ignored when inconvenient." This philosophical approach to warfare was proving surprisingly effective against an enemy that had perfected their tactics over millennia of successful conquest. The Xerathi military machine operated on principles of technological superiority and strategic orthodoxy, concepts that apparently meant nothing to humans who treated military engagement like an elaborate improvisation exercise. The breaking point came when human forces began launching coordinated attacks that violated several fundamental assumptions about space combat. They used civilian vessels as suicide ramming attacks, turned cargo ships into mobile weapons platforms,
and somehow convinced a population of pacifist philosophers from Vega 7 to help them calculate optimal orbital bombardment trajectory. They're not just fighting, Zek 4 transmitted in his final report before withdrawing from the Sol system. They're adapting our own tactics against us, while simultaneously implementing strategies that don't exist in any military database. They've weaponized unpredictability itself. The retreat of a Xerathi destroyer was an event so unprecedented that it triggered emergency protocols throughout the Dominion's intelligence network. Species that had cowered before Xerathi power for centuries suddenly began reviewing their own defensive capabilities with renewed interest. If humans could resist the seemingly unstoppable Conquest machine, perhaps the galactic balance of power wasn't as fixed as everyone had assumed. Back at Dominion headquarters, Agent Dex 9 stared at the updated human assessment with optical sensors that registered something approaching cosmic bewilderment. The species that had scored 2.1 out of 100 on their comprehensive evaluation had just forced the retreat of one of the galaxy's most feared military forces through sheer bloody-minded determination and tactical creativity. New classification, Flux Prime inquired, his gaseous form rippling with what might have been nervous energy. Dex 9 manipulated the database interface with the reluctant precision of someone revising their fundamental understanding of galactic civilization. The human file was updated with a new designation that reflected their newfound status in the cosmic hierarchy. Category 1, Immediate Strategic Concern. He announced, Threat Assessment, Unpredictable, Military Capability, Tactical Doctrine, apparently non-existent, which makes them more dangerous than species with actual military doctrine. The revised assessment included a note that would become legendary in intelligence circles. Previous evaluation may have confused human unpredictability with incompetence. This error in judgment nearly resulted in significant military setback. Recommend immediate reclassification and comprehensive tactical analysis. Also recommend investigation into human offers of pizza as potential diplomatic avenue. Throughout the galaxy, news of the Xerathi retreat spread faster than their conquest fleets had ever traveled. Species that had considered themselves doomed began to wonder if resistance might be possible after all. The humans, those 2.1 rated failures who couldn't even survive on most planets without life support, had done something that 3 millennia of advanced civilizations had failed to accomplish. They had made the Xerathi Empire blink. The galactic community's understanding of human capabilities would require complete revision, but perhaps more importantly, they had learned something about the dangers of bureaucratic assumption. Sometimes the most dangerous species isn't the one with the highest score on your evaluation forms, it's the one that refuses to be evaluated by your standards in the first place. Humanity had been labeled a failure by a galaxy that measured success through conventional metrics. They had proven that success sometimes came from the spectacular ability to ignore what was supposed to be impossible, and do it anyway.